Hi, I'm Wendy Bird. I'm the president of EMDRIA,
I'm Marisol Solar-Derlacher, and I'm the president-elect.
and we are here today to present the 2022 EMDRIA Advocacy Award to Marshall Lyles. Marshall is an EMDRIA approved consultant with over 20 years of practice in family and play therapy. He has extensive speaking and training experience and has worked in a variety of mental health settings. Marshall conducts consultation and leads trainings in both parenting and professional settings. And much of his consultation and training focuses on the use of sand tray therapy within a trauma-informed context. Marshall is known as an empathic, effective teacher of EMDR, especially in working with children, and it is an active advocate to ensure EMDR is available and effective for our small ones. Numerous colleagues sing his praises for his teachings and work to advance knowledge and practice in EMDR. We know Marshall from his service on the board and commitment to ensuring that those who are treated as invisible, especially children or those who are disabled, are seen and valued. Marshall has been active in serving the Child and Adolescent Special Interest Group for EMDRIA, and we can think of no one who's more deserving of recognition as an EMDR advocate than Marshall. His commitment is grounded with kindness and empathy, and we are glad to have a few minutes to spend with him today. Welcome, Marshall.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and congratulations.
Thank you.
We're just going to ask you a few questions. I know everyone's interested to hear your experience, your journey, and what you have to say. And so, I think that you're very known for your compassion, your passion and commitment to working with children and making EMDR really accessible and effective for them. And I know that can be really hard work. Can you share with us a little bit about the influences in your life that compelled you to do this work?
Sure. I was actually born with an illness, a form of muscular dystrophy. And so in hindsight, I think this illness has been a teacher for me for a very long time and has been forcing me to be, more grounded in my body and to have compassionate conversations with myself in the midst of a lot of struggle and pain. And even though I lived in a rural part of Texas where therapy wasn't available, there was something inherently therapeutic about creativity. And there was something resilience building and trauma sensitive just about play and writing and art. And so I think between the illness and just my inherent love for all things creative, I was put on a path I didn't know existed before I really had any ability to make a conscious choice.
Mm-hmm. It makes so much sense that we kind of learn through our own life experiences. I think play from a societal standpoint is so undervalued. So anytime we can advocate for bringing more into play into the world, I think that's a great gift.
I totally agree with that, Wendy. And when I was in undergrad, my whole plan was to be a writer. I was studying English poetry and then journalism communications. And so I had started writing for a little newspaper and I thought that's where I was headed. And it was an advisor of mine that sat me down and said, you have a job with us and yet you're writing about therapy. Are you sure? Because I was writing about creativity and human interests and what helps people heal. And so I had never really even exposed to anything formal in the therapeutic world, but it was a journalism teacher and mentor who was the one who sent me over to meet with her marriage and family friend and said, I think your spirit is trying to do something different than this that you've chosen. And so that was how it all started.
Well, I'm so glad that they did point that out. So Excellent.
That's so great and that's so poignant, Marshall, that, no matter, sometimes I think it's important to remember that we are put on this path, even if we don't initially know it, that there are ways that if we listen, we get back on the path that we're supposed to be on. But I'm so curious about your initial work, your early work with children. What are some pivotal moments that you recall in your early work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was in the field for probably a good 7 or 8 years before I discovered EMDR. And so I had come out of a marriage and family program. And for all of those years, I was almost always working more than one job. And all of my jobs were agency based. And so I was at a children's home and a treatment center for kids and teens, and was even doing work at a medical hospital for kids, and then also contracting for child protective services. And so I was only around intense attachment trauma before I really understood what attachment trauma was. And so I just remember constantly having some sort of awareness that the people I was serving didn't start off life in the same way that I did, and yet we had something in common, and I couldn't find words for it. But one day when I was working at the children's home, I was walking one of the teens back from my office to his cottage, and he asked if we could take a shortcut through the field. And I pointed out, and I was like, oh, as you might notice, I need a little more stability walking, so we're going to have to stay on the concrete. And he asked, and kids didn't often ask about, what was going on with, the braces I wore with my cane or anything. But he asked, and so I briefly told him, and he said, that explains it. We don't understand how someone like you understands us, but pain knows pain. And it was this moment of me understanding, maybe for the first time, that my physical pain wasn't a liability in the work. And it was the kids I worked with who were teaching me that we all have to make peace with pain, or we can't be healers. That's just not a part of the trajectory of this career. If you're not going to be okay being able to notice your pain and notice other people's pain. I've been thinking a lot too about attunement from those early days, before I knew the word attunement, and we have so much more relational neuroscience now. And that's part, it was the part of me that struggled, that was really leading the way and seeing others who had such different life experiences from mine, all the while, understanding that they were also teaching me humility, because we were really different, and they didn't need me to pretend like we were the same. They just needed me to notice when we had same parts, and same moments. And it was a beautiful work. I miss those kids. I miss that work a lot.
Yeah, it kind of gave me chills when I heard you. It made me reflect back on some of my early days with kiddos too. When you think about advancing EMDR, what have you seen as some of the challenges to increase recognition and acceptance?
Yeah, I think many of my colleagues who are either child therapists or expressive arts therapists who work with all ages felt like me a pressure to let go of, working with metaphor and creativity in order to embrace EMDR. And while there might be a moment of, just having to learn language and terms, that, there's so much room for all of the beautiful expressive arts in our field. But I think that there has been often, especially in the early days, a misunderstanding about that collaboration and integration between the two disciplines. And that was preventative in some ways of it being embraced. The other thing is, sometimes I do worry about how eager we are to make everything evidence-based. That even though I'm so grateful for all the empirical evidence we have, and it's really critical to have quantitative backing, anytime you start thinking only in terms of trying to prove that something's generalizable, you're always leaving people out. There are always the outliers and the people just on the outside, not represented in the studies. And as a long-term representative of the outliers, I think we need to make sure that in order to keep advancing it and to overcome some of the hurdles, that we don't step away from qualitative studies that really dive into the lived experience of people who haven't really been served well by therapy in general, including EMDR. And we've got to do better at understanding their lives and their personal obstacles and their view of trauma and healing and therapy before we just jump into trying to prove that things can be big and broadly applicable. I don't think that quantitative measures are the only way to increase visibility and to decrease, obstacles and acceptance, especially for the communities I want to be serving.
It's such a good point, and so true. We have to be able to think about both kinds of ways people show up and both ways information is presented. What would you say is the most successful or moment in your leadership role?
Oh, it's such a scary word. That word leadership just panics me immediately. I feel really, really proud of all the consultees I've seen, step in to doing the work, people who come from so many different communities and are able to represent voices that have been often quieted, and to, really bring points of view that have been lacking. So I when I think back over all of those really wonderfully brave souls who are willing to make waves and have trusted me to be a part of their journey, that feels really warm. Probably the thing that brings me the most joy.
Very nice.
Marshall, when you think about the challenges that you've faced, what has motivated you to keep going? And maybe more specifically, like in the work that you do and trying to advance effective use and maybe more expansive use of EMDR therapy.
Yeah.
What lessons have you learned in light of those challenges?
If I go back to what disability has taught me, I think it has prepared me well for the EMDR aspect of that question myself. That disability, like so many other things we're learning, socioculturally, is a created concept. It's a social construct, and the reality is any physiological impairment or illness or even neurodiverse presentation wouldn't be a disability if the waiting world was already accommodating. Disability comes from having a world that's not prepared to receive you as you are. And then as a result, your abilities, your differences, your disabilities become pronounced. And so there is this gift, though, that comes in having to navigate that and push back against expectations and agendas and really just an unwelcome society, and that you can't afford to not be innovative. When you walk into a room, you're already having to think innovatively. You're thinking, how am I going to navigate this space? And in addition to the relationships, involved. And so there is this survival gift that comes that I think has become an important part of my EMDR work that applies to all people, not just those with disability and not just those who are children. Is AIP says believe in the inherent possibility of a person, and so in disability you learn you have to believe in your innovative power. And so I love that, and I'm so appreciative of it. And I don't want to only believe in people's inherent trauma healing wisdom once I get to phase 4. and I'm following them in free association. I want in every phase of the work that all of us do in EMDR that we're treating clients like they're trustworthy, that their symptoms and their presentations make sense, that they have come from somewhere and they're messengers and they're communicating, and they're not something for us to overcome. They're something for us to partner with. And so I think all of those are the lovely gifts that have come from struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
And what would you say to those who want to be a spokesperson or an advocate for EMDR, just in general, or anything about specific populations?
So do your self-work first. Don't try to speak for people. You speak for yourself. And that comes from being self-aware. That comes from going to therapy. That comes from going to workshops that make you feel uncomfortable. That comes from listening to voices teach from perspectives that are not natural for you. It means you have to develop patterns in relationships with uncovering implicit biases. You have them. We all have them. They're everywhere. And in order to be an advocate, you have to understand that stepping towards trying to care for groups of people mean that you're going to make big, messy mistakes. And you have to have the ability to notice those ruptures and then the humility to step towards repair repeatedly, repeatedly. You have to understand that not all the people in front of you are going to fit into the protocols you've been given. And what are you going to do? And how are you going to recognize when maybe this just is harder work than you imagined, and when maybe the work that the way you're trying to work is not the fit for the person in front of you. I think that's a part of being an advocate, is being able to pivot, but you can't pivot if you don't notice, and you can't notice if you don't make space. I think we love to use the phrase holding space in our field. I still don't know what it means, but I definitely know that you can't hold space if you haven't created space. And so, yeah, you got to look in and see what's required to maybe set some things aside so you have room for the uncertain and for the uncomfortable.
That's so beautiful, Marshall. I couldn't agree more. Is there anything that you think, when you think about expanding our use of EMDR, what we need to know, how we need to think about it? Anything that comes to mind when you think about that?
Yeah, I think as a community, we need to be better at disagreeing with each other. I think that's going to be vital to preserving this as a modality for years to come. Let's be diverse. Let's be opinionated. Let's hear each other. Just because someone has a different perspective on, the background or the protocol, or whether or not even we should use the word protocol, those are all things that we need to have room for without it moving to, attacking. And I think sometimes we have schools of thought that turn on one another, and it gets in the way of the people who are just waiting for help and compassion and love. So be passionate, be thoughtful, be brave enough to change your mind. Be open to hearing. But I think we kill what we don't let flex. And so if EMDR, as we're doing it, doesn't change in 10 years, it's going to be a problematic, not because EMDR isn't working, but because we should all be smarter in 10 years. We should all know more. I never got to know Dr. Shapiro personally, but just hearing her speeches over time, it seemed like she changed her mind a lot. She was comfortable with that. And so I think we've got to find a way to follow those parts of the example of how are we updating what we know, and how are we listening to fields outside of EMDR, and what are we treating as as relevant? How are we starting to realize that the way that we normed things in EMDR was that it wasn't inclusive? And so what are we going to be doing to compensate for those things so that it can become more and more globally relevant without trying to force all people into the same category or way of healing? I think criticizing something shows that you love it, you know, and I'm hoping that we all find more and more peace with embracing that.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Marshall. The pleasure of being on the board with you. So it's a particular pleasure for us to be here presenting this award for you. We are so proud to be your colleague and to recognize your work in helping advance and expand EMDR. And so it is my distinct honor to thank you for all that you've done, to wish you even greater impact and influence in the future, and on behalf of the EMDRIA board and the organization, to present you with the Advocacy Award. And so I'm going to pass it over. Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you to you both, and to
Yes,
the
so
whole board and to the committees involved. I feel really honored.
yes, we are honored to have you as a colleague and in our community.
Thank you so much for all that you do, Marshall.